Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm GOOOOO, and today I am going to be yapping incessantly after rewatching and rewatching the keynote over and over more times than I care to admit, meanwhile breaking down all the details of the new combat system that was unveiled and introduced for the first time, known as Evolved Mode. I believe that's what they called it. I believe they called it Evolved Mode. We're just going to call it Evolved Jobs from here on out. Now this video is going to be a little different. Normally I'll just script out everything when I do these discussionary videos, but I don't really have time to do that. I would like to get this out as sooner rather than later, so I took some notes. I've combed over the footage time and time again, and I'm kind of gonna just do it off cuff, so here we go. So first thing I want to go over is the actual Evolved job changes. So starting in 8.0 when the expansion comes out, all current jobs in the game, the 21 we have currently, are going to get an evolved form of the job. The two new jobs coming will only have evolved mode, and then our current jobs will have this new mode on top of the old mode, the way we've been playing, which they called reborn mode. We're gonna call it old and boring. What is this evolved mode, you may ask? To sum it up for you real quick, I'm not going to go super into detail on what it is in general. Mioni's done a really good video on it. Renon, whatever. Also, the cat girl also has done a really good video on it. I'm sure many others are going to do many more. I'm not going to do that here. We'll just briefly go over the main ideas. Main goal seems to be to reduce button bloat down to, I believe they said like 15 or 16 buttons. It looks like all of the job gauges as well have been completely reworked, or at least the vanilla ones that we are used to were not shown. All party buffs are being removed from both the Evolved mode, which never had them, and Reborn mode, apparently. The goal of that is to kill off the 2-minute meta we've been playing in for the past decade, or for me, for the past year, where basically the way fights are laid out is everyone unloads their entire burst onto a boss, and then you do a couple mechanics, and then the boss stands still while you take your turn to do all of your combo again every 2 minutes. Instead, they are trying to move to a more fluid, dynamic gameplay, where you're less strict on rotation and more so reactionary towards what's actually happening in the fight. And I will touch on that more as well as we get closer to the end. And then the other really big thing that was kind of announced was the main tank and off tank split. That is correct. This is mostly a tanking video. Starting with Evercold, tanks are going to be divided up into two sub-roles, kind of like how healers have barrier healers and pure healers. We're going to have main tanks and off tanks, and I will also be touching on that in more detail. But first, let's go into what's actually changing with Paladin. Or I guess before I get into Paladin, let's start with the tank role actions in general. This will kind of start to showcase some of the new tech and features coming with Evercold. First things first is the introduction of contextual abilities, is what I'm going to refer to them as. The first example they gave us was Provoke and Shirk. They are being combined into a single button action. When you target an enemy, you will provoke them. When you target a friendly, you will shirk them. This is going to become a reoccurring theme. If you are not a fan of having two inputs, which me personally in the context of Provoke, I am not, you can macro your shirk the way I have been doing it ever since I started playing 14, where my shirk is actually a macro to always cast the skill on the second party member, always my co-tank. That way, I don't have to worry about targeting the tank and doing it manually. In theory, this should still work with Shirk because you will technically be targeting the tank when you activate the macro. Thus, you can have a provoke button for the boss and a Shirk button separate if you wish. Interject and Low Blow have also been combined into a single skill. Thank God. I have said it since I started this game that Interject is fucking useless 99% of the time. Low Blow is kind of useful in dungeons or in trash packs because you can kick the biggest mob and reduce its damage. Moving on to the more important role skills, Reprisal, Rampart, and Arm's Length all seem to be present and none of them seem to have changed, or at the very least, we don't know if they got changed. You are going to have less defensive mitigation buttons as a whole on your kit going forward, and so maybe they will compensate for that by increasing potencies, reducing cooldowns, something to that effect, but we honestly haven't seen that because in the showcase, at least when I was looking, and I'm pretty sure I didn't miss it, I did not see Yoshi P or the other guy. Was it Mr. Prime? Was the other guy Mr. Prime? I think it was. The two gentlemen on the stage, I don't think either of them used Reprisal, Rampart, or Arm's Length, so we're not really clear on what the cooldown is, and we never saw tooltips, so we don't know what the potency is. But we do know the buttons still exist. For now, let's just assume they are business as usual, and let's move on to the Paladin offensive kit. First things first, Holy Spirit and Clemency have been combined into another one of those contextual actions that we were talking about. Now, if you target an enemy, you will cast Holy Spirit, just as you always have. And if you target an ally, you will cast Clemency. If you have no target, then you will Clemency yourself, which is actually kind of nice. I actually really like this change. This is one that could be useful. I will probably still macro it alongside my party list, which I'll put an image on screen or something here, or maybe it'll be in the background footage. I'm not sure how I'm going to edit this yet, but it'll be there. I use a macro so I can click next to a party member to heal them or pocket them with a mitigation, and that is something you will still be able to do, but a very fun change. Another thing to note about Holy Spirit is it actually looks like your Confiteor got moved to Holy Spirit only when you have your Imperator buff rolling, which we'll talk about in just a moment, which changes that free cast Holy Spirit, the one that has no cast time, into the big sword from the ground animation as opposed to the dainty ass Holy Spirit animation. Thank you. Holy Spirit is not an exciting skill to use. It looks boring. Speaking of boring, every tank has a 1-2-3 combo. We've always had a 1-2-3 combo as far as I'm aware. They're never the most exciting thing. However, they are all being consolidated into a single button. I'm going to imagine this is going to be par for the course for all of the tanks. We've only seen Paladin, but safe to assume. I don't really see anything particularly new about this except for one change, and that is that the Atonement combo has been removed, and in its stead, Continuation has been added to the Paladin kit from Gunbreaker. We did also see Continuation on the Dragoon showcase, so it is possible perhaps Continuation will now be a melee skill as opposed to a Gunbreaker skill specifically. And in the context of Paladin, I only saw two instances. One was at the end of your 1-2-3 combo, you would be able to use Espation. I don't know how to pronounce that skill. Our old skill, or at least the tooltip, you know, the little icon on the hotbar is the Espation icon. At the continuation slot after your third hit of your combo. Also at the end of your Imperator combo, which has also been consolidated into a single button. That final OGCD at the end of the combo has also been moved to the continuation spot as opposed to being on Imperator itself, thus combining all of those into single button inputs. Some may complain and say, this is making the job too simple. In my personal opinion, if you find some sort of skillful self-satisfaction out of pressing the number 1 and then the number 2 as opposed to just pressing the same button over and over, then you, my friend, have other issues to worry about. Not that I'm perfect and have never fucked up my melee combo in the past, but it's not good scuff. It's not skillful scuff, it's meaningless scuff. And if we're going to consolidate the buttons, I'm a big fan of this change. Your self buff has been completely removed. Flight or Flight is gone entirely, as is Goring Blade. Now, I do believe they said they're removing team buffs from the Reborn or the old and boring versions of the jobs, which makes me think our current version of Paladin, when 8.0 comes out, will just lose Fight or Flight entirely, and you would just hit Goring Blade as a cooldown GCD. I am not sure about that. We'll find out, but just note, Fight or Flight is gone completely, as is its follow-up. So is our ground dot, that little AoE that you drop down that does a dot. That has also been completely removed. We talked about Espation, that got moved to continuation. Shield Bash has been removed and actually combined with Shield Lob, so now your Shield Throw will be a Shield Throw like normal, but if you are within melee range is now that Shield Bash stun, which is fantastic. We get to keep the skill without added button bloat. That's always good to see. Gap Closer no longer has any form of potency and thus is no longer a damage ability. However, we will be talking about that again. And the real big one that I'm noticing is missing here is the actual AoE 1 and 2 combo, as well as the AoE version of Holy Spirit. They weren't shown as icons in any of the slides or any of the footage. We did not see an AoE used whatsoever. Imperator on live version, as well as its follow-up sword combo, is technically an AoE with splash damage, as is Confiteor, which Holy Spirit turns into, like I mentioned before, so it is possible that those are your AoE combo, especially considering Imperator no longer has a cooldown. Instead, it is tied to the gauge. Probably should have mentioned that. This is why we script things, but we're not doing that today. The gauge, you'll notice it looks weird on the keynote, but I've kind of paying attention, figured out what it has. So we're gonna skip that first bar because that's the defensives, and we'll skip to the second one. I'll talk about defensives later. That second bar will just build as you are in combat. Once that bar fills, you gain a charge. That charge is what you spend to start the Imperator combo, which means Imperator doesn't have a cooldown, it has charges. You can consider that a cooldown with extra steps, sure, but what that means is you can cast this full Imperator combo back to back twice in a row. That combined with Confiteor, which at least on live is an AoE, so I imagine that version of Holy Spirit is an AoE. Potentially Holy Spirit itself is just an AoE with fall off damage. Maybe the 1-2-3 combo is just a conal attack now? It's not clear because they only demonstrated on a single individual, but I can't imagine we're just gonna outright lose access to AoEs as a whole. Or they intend when you're pulling ads in a dungeon that you need to grab all the ads, stack them on top, use your Imperator to grab a bunch of aggro, and then pop that Imperator more off cooldown, or off gauge down, I guess, to keep that aggro while everything in between is single target. Editing Kuro, cutting it real quick, mostly because I forgot to mention this when I recorded the video. One thing that I did notice is that this stance toggle to turn on your enmity stance doesn't exist. Either they forgot to show the icon and it is still in the game, or just didn't think it was relevant for the showcase, or was removed entirely. I'm kind of 50-50 on this. The gauge does have a crest part of the gauge that never really lit up or seemed to change with any of the inputs that were being used in the showcase. So maybe that crest is just the word they're using for toggling your stance on and off. However, I did notice whenever they casted Provoke, the same icon for Iron Will, which is Paladin's stance button, currently on live version, popped up as a self buff on the character after casting Provoke. So I'm wondering if instead of actually having a full-on tank stance like we currently have, if they're removing that entirely in favor of Provoke not only gives you a big burst of enmity on the target you're provoking, but also gives you a buff that increases enmity generation for the duration of the buff. Just thought I would throw that in there. I meant to put it in, forgot to do it. That's enough of offensive tools. Kind of. Let's move on to the defensive tools because this is where things get extra interesting when it comes to tanking. After all, we're a tank. That is our main purpose in life. First of all, Passage of Arms has been changed, or at least tweaked. It is still a 120-second cooldown, but it also seems to have a follow-up cast. Not clear if this is a cast that needs to be used out of Passage of Arms, or if you're able to move and break Passage while still holding onto that buff, being able to use it. And it looks to be like an AoE heal of some sorts after using Passage of Arms, which in theory would work really well. Even if we still use Passage the way we've always used it, you usually use it before a raid wide, this gives you a follow-up heal to recover after the damage. Sentinel, Divine Veil, Holy Shelptron, and the Rampart, Reprisal, and Arm's Length I mentioned before all seem to be there. Sentinel's cooldown seems to be the same as always. Sorry, it's Guardian. The upgraded version is Guardian. Guardian's cooldown seems to be 120 seconds, but we don't know its potency. Divine Veil's cooldown did get increased to 120 seconds from 90 seconds, so that is very interesting. My prediction is that this is to kind of open the door for those off-tanks to come in and fill that role of being the group mitigation. Holy Sheltron does not have a cooldown, but is instead tied to that defensive gauge that we skipped over earlier, which basically operates the exact same way as the Imperator one, without need to use auto attacks to charge it up, but it works as it's always done, basically. On the current live server, Sheltron costs 50 Oath Gauge to cast, and you can hold up to 100. which means you can double cast Holy Sheltron relatively quickly. Holy Sheltron also has a very, very interesting new mechanic where when you take a hit in the first 8 seconds, or I guess the full 8 seconds of Sheltron being active, you will actually get Goring Blade, or at least an icon that looks like Goring Blade, as a counter attack. Even more exciting is that there is actually a perfect guard version of this, where if you catch damage in the first 4 seconds, you get Sepulcher. I told you Atonement was coming back, didn't I? Sepulcher, or at least its icon, makes a return, more potent follow-up attack that also seems to leave a lingering buff on the player. It's not clear what that buff does or if that buff means anything in particular, but it is something I wanted to point out. I'm a very, very big fan of this new parry mechanic, and quite possibly might be the thing I am most excited about when it comes to the new Paladin. The thing I'm second most excited about, however, is the actual gap closer. It has been completely reworked. I mentioned earlier it no longer has potency, thank fucking god. I've been waiting for this. Dark Knight doesn't, Gunbreaker doesn't, Warrior and Paladin still were stuck with potency on their gap closers, and it really annoyed me that I had to use my gap closer as a damage button and not a mobility tool. But looking closely at the footage, it seems to be the case that it no longer does damage. On top of that, it is now a contextual action where you can use it to gap close to an ally. If you do this, you will put cover on them. This is a massive, and I mean massive buff to cover. On the current live server, cover costs Oath Gauge, which means it shares a resource with Holy Sheltron, and intervention, which more often than not, in 99% of circumstances, it is more worth your time to just put intervention or Sheltron for a friend on the target as opposed to covering them. Intervention seems to be completely absent and just removed from the kit, but cover, by being tied to the gap close, its own separate cooldown, no longer steals Oath Gauge from Holy Sheltron, or this new version of the gauge, but also has its cooldown reduced from what I believe is 120 seconds on live server all the way down to a measly 30. And because you don't need to use your gap closer for damage, it means you can fully rely on using your gap closer as a cover tool, making cover suddenly a really good skill. It is unclear, however, if the cover target taking damage will trigger your Sheltron counter. They tried to show it off in the showcase, however, the enemy they were fighting was doing a tank buster cleave, meaning both targets still got hit. The cover target and Yoshi P standing next to the cover target, so they both took the damage directly from the boss, thus obviously they both got to counter. I would not be surprised if cover tether does transfer the damage through you to Holy Sheltron, thus letting you counter without being the one taking the direct hit. It looks very, very fun and exciting, and might be a way for you to fish for extra damage using cover. Kind of like a little known Blackest Knight that I'm quite familiar with. Only other thing I kind of want to note here is that Bulwark is completely removed. That is your skill that would give you increased block chance. It just simply does not seem to exist anymore. You just have the aforementioned Guardian, Divine Veil, Rampart Reprisal, Holy Sheltron, and Arm's Length. So, with that out of the way, what do I think of this? Where do I think tanking is going? And am I a fan of what we're actually seeing? First off, yes, I am a huge fan. This looks so much fucking fun. I do have a couple of concerns. One being if the 2-minute meta will truly die off, especially because we have potions are still a thing. We're still going to try and fit things under buff window. So I can still see people trying to consolidate all of their best buttons into a short window and not using things as tools. We already saw Bard still has party buffs. Maybe Bard's the only one, but if one job has party buffs, then there's a high likelihood that we're all gonna play along to its tune. There was a pun intended there. That being said, we might see pops get reworked, unclear. And the fight design itself does need to support this removal of a 2-minute meta by maybe even deliberately being extra stressful every 2 minutes to truly punish people who are trying to stick to the old way and really force you to just play in a more dynamic setting. If they just make fights like they have been for the past year, as amazing as they have been, it won't really change the 2-minute meta, and I think we will just be playing cool, fun new versions of the jobs with less buttons to press. Very reminiscent of Viper. In fact, I think Viper might have been the precursor test ground for what became Evolved jobs, and it's very successful and very, very fun, even in this 2-minute meta, but I think that might be what the game ends up looking like if they don't support this new agenda with the fight design itself. Rotation itself looks very fun, but very simple. That being said, Paladin has always been extremely simple in its rotation. It is too early to tell. We don't really know potencies or cooldowns. We know some cooldowns, and we do know how the gauge works, or at least can roughly guess how the gauge works. How this is actually going to work out in a full extended boss fight, unclear. Also, we're not really sure what GCD times are going to look like. Obviously, everything here is subject to change, as this is a very, very old dev build. My personal hope is that if we're going to reduce the amount of buttons on the bar, I would like to see increased GCD, thus increasing player inputs. That alone may determine how this new Paladin feels. However, the nature of Paladin being a very simple tank means there isn't a lot of information for us to go off of to really begin to speculate what the other more active tanks like Gunbreaker and Dark Knight are going to feel like. We do still at least get a decent idea of where tanking is headed as a whole. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Main tanking and off tanking. I personally know a few people who are not excited for this change and are not particularly happy about the idea of predetermined roles for tanking. I personally love this idea. I think it's a great way to balance out tanks and create individual niches amongst the different tanks, besides just which one does more damage. It gives the devs more levers to pull, and I'm looking forward to this. However, I do want to clarify before I go forward. For those of you worried about this new setting for tanks, that maybe your favorite tank is going to lose a lot of its necessary tools, or that you wouldn't be able to play with 2 off tanks or 2 main tanks or vice versa, I do want to remind you of a few things. 1. Evolved mode combat is still going to be able to be used for all prior content in the game, and the most important thing to note is this includes ultimates. This is the first time we're really going to see a major, or at least first time in a while, a major overhaul to combat that's going to affect something as old as the ultimates themselves. Sure, you may be playing a level 70 Paladin when you do GOOOOO or UCOB, but you would be playing an evolved level 70 Paladin, and so it's going to perform completely differently, as well as all of the group buffs being removed will also change it. So these do need to function in old content correctly, while also being prepared for new content. Just looking at the recent fights that have been added to Dawn Trail in the past year, we've got double auto attacks in bosses like the Tyrant or Lindworm. We have multiple separate bosses like the BJ Boys, tank swaps, light party mechanics, again like the BJ Boys. And that's not even to mention all of the single tank content in the game. Alliance raids, you can't really determine main or off tanks. You have 3 tanks in total, all of which queued randomly. A little bit more so in the chaotic raid, but still, it's mostly a solo tank piece of content. Deep Dungeons and Quantum also are 4-man content with a single tank. Criterion is 4-man content with a single tank. So here's what I predict. All tanks will retain the basic suite of tools we have now, with the exception of the mid-range cooldowns like Bulwark, which are being removed from all of them, or in some cases will probably be combined with other skills depending on the different tanks. I do think it will be preferred that you have 1 main tank job and 1 off tank job, especially at harder content like Savage and Ultimate. However, I do not think it will really matter who's actually playing the primary aggro. Think of this like how healers currently work in Savage. You have a barrier healer and you have a pure healer, and you do want one of each. Rather than stacking a stage and a scholar, you would rather have a scholar and a white mage. But it doesn't really necessarily matter if scholar plays healer 1 positions or if scholar plays healer 2 positions. This is how I foresee tanks going as well. I don't think it actually matters who has tank 1 and tank 2. We're still going to have double bosses, we're still going to have split auto attacks, we're still going to have light party mechanics, and we're still going to have tank swaps, which means it really doesn't matter at the end of the day as long as one of each type of tank is present. In fact, just the way cover works, especially if cover and Holy Sheltron do trigger the counter, this would further support my idea that you would be able to switch between which person is actually taking the primary aggro, as you can dash onto them and fish for extra potency through your counterattacks off of your main tank as a paladin off tank. I genuinely don't believe it's going to be the way Square Enix and Yoshi P described it. It's less so a main tank and off tank, and it's more of a single target mitigation tank versus a group mitigation tank. Paladin and the new tank are going to be more focused on big single target tank buster reduction type damage. Granted, I said more focused. It still has access to Divine Veil, it still has access to Reprisal, it can still help in the group mid department. Off tanks, on the other hand, however, I think are going to be more focused on group mitigation, whether that's through having multiple raid wides at their disposal, lower cooldowns on their raid wides, or by putting some sort of debuff or damage down on the boss through their own attacks. Hopefully they will show off an off tank at Berlin. My guess would be Warrior, so that we have a more concrete idea of them, but for now all we can do is speculate. But anyways, that is all the yapping I have for today. I don't know if you'll enjoy this off-the-cuff, kind of rambly, unscripted version of my usual discussion videos, but I kind of wanted to get one out early when it comes to this tank stuff, because I'm very, very excited. I will, of course, be coming back to this topic in the future, once we get FanFest in Berlin and probably get more information, or at any point that we get in more information, though I imagine we won't be seeing anything until Berlin. But that being said, thank you for sitting with me. Feel free to like, subscribe, let me know what you think of the upcoming tank changes. If you like being a main tank or an off tank, maybe you hate it. I know people who do, but I think it's best we all just sit tight, wait. I'm just glad they're willing to go completely out of the box and flip everything on its head and rework everything. This is probably going to be one of the most exciting expansions we had in a long time, and honestly, it is what 14 needs more than anything. Dawn Trail was a shaky reception, and Evercold is already looking to be more exciting than that ever was. And we're getting not 2 new jobs, but when you think about it, 23 new jobs all day one, so it's going to be a very fun time. But anyways, thank you all for being here. Until next time.